peace and grace and space and openness. Jonathan Stahl's here, and we're just under a couple young trees. Denver's Cheeseman Park. Beautiful things all around us, and I'm just going to offer, as we look up at the sky together, I'm going to offer a reading from this beautiful, soulful book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, Grief and Praise. The author is also the artist. Beautiful illustrations throughout, Martín Prechtel. So I'm just going to read, I'm going to read several paragraphs, and I just ask that you just invite the words and the aches, maybe not literal, not seeing them or feeling them as literal, but just notice where they connect, what they open, how they move with you on the inside and around you. And this is from the introduction, A Little Extra Light for the Bottom of the River. This is towards the end. But more to the point is, if any of this madness is going to change, then it is of greater pertinence to realize that each one of us, in a way, is a nation unto ourselves, and that as a nation we do have the power to change. Inside each one of us, sitting like a well-worn jewel in the clear running river of our own soul, present right here today, there is a deep and noble human being, unknown even to his or her closest neighbor, that more external outer layer of ourselves who has become a personality of the surrounding culture, instead of that true individual, a person indigenous to our own deeper spiritual landscape. The fact that commercial culture always panders to the lowest common denominator of awareness and taste should not stop us in our personal revolution to become real human beings. If there are enough such humans, then collectively, real cultures worth living in, cultures that don't depend on scaredness, scarcity, and sarcasm, could actually begin to cultivate themselves into motion. No longer needing someone else's rails, we could get off the siding. The plastic could disappear, the butterflies could be released, the river could light up. This little book is meant as a companion of encouragement, a little extra light for those deep and noble parts of all of us and our cultures who think they are too small, alone, unsupported, and unseen to make such emotion out loud. It is always good to start small and move slow with such things. Though presently highly twisted, overlooked, and practically forgotten, there are two places where such people can surely begin giving a home to that greater, nobler, and deeper being all of us really are. And that is through two strangely married instinctual talents. If there is ever to be any real peace on earth, all people need to relearn and reestablish the now diminished and hidden arts of grief and praise. For one without the other is not possible. So these are some of those words. This is just beautiful, simple line drawings. Just going into chapter 1, Grief is a Shameless Dreamer. So at this point, I just invite you, take a deep breath wherever this meets you, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 10. Pause the video if it feels right. You might even go back and listen to those words again, just to see and hear and invite what's calling. So we'll just take a deep breath in together, all the way in. And slowly out. All the way in. And slowly out. So I'm going to read the beginning of this first chapter, just the beginning, and it just goes through just a bulleted list of different invitations related to grief. And I just invite you to just allow them to fall and lean and flow where they fall and lean and flow. That it's not, these aren't rules, these aren't lines, these aren't new boxes, they're just invitations. Grief is a shameless dreamer. Grief is what living beings experience when what or whom they love dies or disappears. Grief is not what people feel when they lose what they want or lose what they want to happen, or when they don't get what they think they deserve. This is only disappointment, not the same at all, and is often confused with grief. Grief is natural. To grieve the loss of what we love is as natural as peeing, eating, singing, dreaming, running, or looking under rocks for bugs to feed your frog. More importantly, grieving is necessary. When there is real loss, grieving should never be avoided or postponed. Grieving is absolutely necessary. Without grief, the world would cease to renew itself. The world would cease to exist. Grief is not a preference. For choosing to not have grief when grief is there is to defer and burden someone else with having to do your grieving. This makes the world a sick place. Grief is an obligation to the life one has been awarded, an obligation to life to make more life. To truly and freely grieve as an entire people can revive an entire culture just as much as it can bring back to life an individual. The necessity of active grieving when there is the deep loss of what we love can be done in many ways. It can take many forms, but is lost when it is simply a theatrical act, choreographed to mimic grief. Grief permeates life, and grieving can take many forms, but grief can never be outrun or simply thought away, transcended or meditated into non-existence. Necessary grief, when shunned or unattended, can easily hide for years, even generations, in the skeletal structure of the family collective psyche. Like light, matter, sound, and energy, grief will eventually manifest, even among those in the future who did not consciously experience the loss. So, best to grieve when it's time, to save the world a lot of war and trouble. Grieving is a sacred art, not an art whose products should be sold or seen objectively. Grieving is an art that when it is fully known and made to actively happen in all its grandeur and integrity, is the backbone of all real peace. It is the art of all arts. It is the art behind all real art. Grief is not sorrow, though there are certainly stages of grieving that are sorrow-filled. Real grieving refuses to remain in sorrow. Grief is a phenomenon that must be purposely done, for grieving needs time and motion to allow the medicine of grief's dreams to fully blossom into new life, to fill the loss. Grief is active. Grief is movement, not stagnation. Real grieving never wallows. Only nations capable of the true art of grief, grieving their mistakes and the deeply felt losses they have endured or have caused to happen, can say that they are not pools of emotional stagnation, dressed up in the spoils of ungrieved wars disguised as good business, heaping their unwept tears upon the poor and struggling as the currency of poverty. Grief has a sound that embarrasses the repressed and offends the oppressive. Grief is the sound of being alive. Grief is not depression. A griever is not depressed. Depression comes from not being able to grieve, which converts our losses into violence. Grief is a shameless dreamer who thinks nothing of healing impossible despair head on, of reionizing impossible situations, of healing impossible sickness, of depolarizing impossible hard-headed people. Grief thinks nothing of impossibility, only of what makes life more deliciously alive. Grief doesn't care if he, she, they are badly misunderstood, underestimated, or forgotten. They're not hurt because people run away when they see them coming, because grief has one real good friend. Grief is the best friend of praise, because praise is a grandiose griever. Without both grief and praise, life is only hate and mediocrity. Grief and praise are renters whose landlord is love. Because they are best friends, both grief and praise live together in the same building, but in opposing quarters, in the left and right chambers of love's great thumping house called the heart. Together, both grief and praise work hard to print their own money, which they use to pay their rent to love, for theirs is the common currency of life's great beauty. Praise also has a sound that always moves and motivates but never ends. One can only catch up within earshot of praise's sound or pull away, but praise of life never ends. Grief is a worker on life's big highways, and praise is grief's eternal freight train, forever hauling the vision of life's bigger picture from stars whose light hasn't got here yet, which grief uses to refill the potholes of our losses. Praise is grief's voice, and neither ever disappears, because they are the sound of all parts of the world and universe, each living according to its own nature, each entire in itself, each a willing participle in the great prayer of praise, singing the world back to life. So let's just take a couple deep breaths just to bring in these words, these invitations. Breathing all the way in. And slowly out. All the way in. And slowly out. And just that we breathe in, just more openness, more connection to grief in our own lives, in our own being, that we expand, just invite an expanding awareness, connection to grief, the role of grief, the movement, the active relationship to it. So just breathing that in. Slowly breathing it out. And that as we breathe out, a renewed connection to praise, these chambers of the heart. So breathing in a relationship to grief, and breathing out a relationship to praise. Breathing in, invitation to grief. Breathing out, invitation to praise. Peace.